Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Montana Museum of Art and Culture's lecture series on the legacy of the Clark family. I'm Raphael Chacon, the director of the museum, and it is a delight to see you all here on this blustery evening in Missoula. This lecture series is taking place in conjunction with a wonderful exhibition, the William A. Clark Collection, A Homecoming. And as many of you already know, since the show has been open for some time now, the museum recently acquired 9 works of art from the estate of Senator William A. Clark. Although only a small portion of a vast collection the senator acquired over a century ago, this is an exceptional group of objects. It includes a sculpture of the Madonna and Child attributed to Italian Renaissance sculptor Donatello, and I'm not talking the Ninja Turtle. And it also includes paintings by other formidable artists, including the Englishman Thomas Gainsborough, the French Baroque painter Jean-Honoré Fragonard, the School of Barbizon artists Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, Jean-Charles Cazin, and Jules Dupré. And the Dupré painting, which is actually the largest painting in this collection, is in Seattle undergoing conservation. When it in fact is finished, it'll come back to Missoula, and so stay tuned. I'd like to briefly acknowledge the folks who made that exhibition possible. You can read their names on the wall labels, and by the way, the gallery will be opened. Both galleries, the Clark Collection and the exhibition of Stephanie Frostad's work, just across the lobby, both galleries will be open as soon as this lecture is over. And you're more than welcome to view the exhibitions and stick around and enjoy it. Anyway, I'd like to take a moment to honor the lady who almost single-handedly was responsible for bringing the Clark Collection to Montana. While acquiring that collection was a team effort, the person who had the foresight, connections, and gumption to bring those significant works to the Treasure State was a woman by the name of Nancy Matthews, and many of you know Nancy. Nancy is ill and could not attend this evening, but I think we owe her a round of applause for her great efforts. And also, before introducing our guest speaker this evening, I'd also like to thank the sponsors of tonight's event. We have an anonymous donor in the audience, as well as representatives from the U of M School of Journalism. Please give it up for those folks who made this event possible. So this evening we're gathered to hear Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Bill Dedman on his extraordinary research and publication on the Clark family and its legacy. Bill got his start in journalism at the age of 16, the tender age of 16, as a copy boy at the Chattanooga Times. And he has had a stellar career in the field. He's written for the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Boston Globe. For 8 years, he reported for NBC News and also for Newsday. He received the Pulitzer Prize in 1989 and has received numerous national journalism awards for online reporting, feature writing, and public service. He's also a really funny guy. I'm not building him up or anything, but I must admit that I could hardly put this book down, Bill Dedman's Empty Mansions, The Mysterious Life of Huguette Clark, and the Spending of a Great American Fortune. I typically don't like celebrities, I don't follow celebrities, but in this case, I was really drawn to this story, and I took vicarious pleasure in learning about this family, this remarkable family with such strong ties to this great state. But coupled with a lot of pleasure and a lot of the humor that's in the story, I was also severely infuriated by this book. So many times I wanted to fling it across the room because this story is, it's a lot of highs and a lot of lows as well. It's a very compelling story, if at times it's exasperating. And I admire Bill Dedman for his restraint, his even-handedness in telling the story, and his sometimes deadpan humor, which I think you'll pick up on as you read the book. If you haven't read this book, I highly, highly recommend it. Get a copy, it will not disappoint. And Bill has agreed to autograph the book this evening. It's for sale in the lobby afterwards for $28 this evening, and I believe it's a cash-only sale. So I apologize for that, but alas, that's where we are. So please join me in welcoming Bill Deadman to the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and to the University of Montana.
Good evening. I'm glad I got here in time for summer. It's nice. I hear it's warmed up. There's a lot to cover here. We're going to ramble a little bit. If nothing else, you'll see a lot of photographs. We'll hear a little of Huguette Clark's voice in a few snippets of audio. And I'm going to try to weave together the story of the father and the daughter, as we tried to do in the book. First, the thank yous. I really appreciate the invitation from the university, from the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and I want to thank those who made this possible. Raphael Chacon, his predecessor, Barbara Kustra, Kathy Veazey, Nancy Matthews, who helped bring the art here, Jeremy Canwell, the curator. How many of you were here in November when Professor Keith Edgerton spoke on this topic here? For those who weren't here, I'll summarize briefly. Keith and I joke about this. He was insanely kind to some out-of-staters who came in and said, "Hi, we're writing the book that you already have been working on for 10 years. And he said, "Here, let me give you copies of all my files." Amazingly generous. To sum up his perspective, quoting Keith Edgerton from MSU Billings, the cumulative sentiment here is that W.A. Clark made a fortune off of the state's resources in the freewheeling, laissez-faire times of the late 19th century, prostituted the political system with his wealth and power, exploited the working class for his own gain, left an environmental wreck behind, and took his millions to other places to benefit a handful of others. It is visceral, and I think that story is now pretty much genetically encoded on the historic perception of ourselves, even if it gets increasingly mythologized on some levels. Well, I'm not here to rebut Keith or to get a bar fight started on this, though you certainly could. But I would like to focus some on the Clark legacy. It's a good occasion to do that with some of the senator's art purchases. I'm sure it's viewed as some of his money finally came back to Montana, a few scraps, if you can call a Donatello and others scraps. If you haven't gone across the hall, as you leave, please go across the hall and look at the pieces in the gallery there. The legend was that Corot, there are 3 pieces by the landscape painter Corot, French painter, in the exhibition, and the legend was that Corot painted, he was so popular that he was much copied, and the story was that he painted 800 landscapes and that American mining millionaires bought 1,100 of them. So Raphael and Jeremy, I trust that somebody has vetted these 3. I'm sure they're all good. Don't worry about it. My co-author, Paul Clark Newell Jr., whose father was Huguette Clark's first cousin, had been writing a family history of the Clarks, of the great man, the senator, just as his father had been writing that history all those years. So if you ask him how long did this book take, he'd say 22 years. But I want to start with where I stumbled in on the story. My wife and I were shopping for a home in Connecticut, having moved from Boston, and we got a little bit out of our price range. And the real estate market had fallen. We were trapped as landlords in one city and renters in another. And just out of exasperation of not being able to afford a home, I started looking at the ones we really couldn't afford. And the most expensive house for sale in Connecticut at that time was a bargain. It had been marked down from the mid $30 million to the high 20s. A 14,000 square foot French mansion built in the 1930s on 52 acres with a river. And so I was looking up the names of the owners. I was going to the town website, looking up who owned these expensive homes. You know, the chairman of GE or Don Imus or whoever. And I didn't know the name Huguette Clark. So I went on the town website, I was looking up the address, and I was reading the zoning records, as one does. And there was a note where her attorney told the town, oh, by the way, as you know, he said, this home has not been lived in since this owner bought it. But it said in the records that this owner had bought it in 1951 and expanded it. I'm not really a very good noticer. I often see somebody else doing a good story and I say, oh, I should have picked up on that. But I have learned that when I do notice something, I should go check it out. So the next morning, I was at the gate of the home in New Canaan, Connecticut, talking with the caretaker, who was very kind. He said that yes, this is Mrs. Clark's home, and he said she's a wonderful employer. He said, I've been here 20 years. I've not met her. He just got paid every month by the attorney sending a check. And as I was leaving, he said, well, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you a question. Do you think maybe she's been dead all this time? I said, well, I have no idea. So I went online to look her up, and I found that she had a nicer unused home in Santa Barbara, California, 20,000 square feet on 20 acres on a mesa, completely private, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And the legend online was that home had not been visited by anyone since the early 1950s, that no Clarks had spent a night in it since that time. And the legend was that the home was still, the table was set for dinner, fresh flowers and that sort of thing. That part was made up. But it was true that no Clarks had spent the night there at that point, nearly 60 years. I tried to visit the home and was run off. And then I thought I'd found Huguette because she had apartments in New York City. This is at 72nd and 5th Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, overlooking the sailboat pond where Stuart Little raced sailboats. I guess that's the best historical reference. She had half the 12th floor, the top floor, 5,000 square feet. She had an apartment on the 8th floor, 5,000 square feet, and she'd bought the apartment, the other half of the 8th floor, to protect her privacy so Richard Nixon couldn't move in after Watergate. So she had 43 rooms in 3 different apartments. And the doorman, Boris, said, oh, no, Mrs. Clark's not here. The elevator doesn't even stop on the 8th floor. And I haven't seen her in at least 20 years, and he didn't know where she was. So I called my editor, and I said, well, I don't think this is what you're paying me to do. I'm supposed to be doing serious investigative reporting. I had a Pentagon story I was going to do, but let me tell you about this. And he said, well, you should go find her. You should find out what's going on with this. I have to admit, I'm not a celebrity reporter. I don't know anything. I learned recently, you may know this, that Roseanne Barr and Rosie O'Donnell are 2 completely different people. I had never had that straight. First, I was surprised that Huguette Clark could still be alive. I found online her name, and that she was the daughter of a well-known U.S. senator, somewhat disreputable, copper miner. But I couldn't quite fathom it. Huguette was born in 1906 in Paris during the Teddy Roosevelt administration. Our 24th president while her father was serving in the United States Senate fighting Roosevelt's environmental reforms. And that was '06. Well, her father had been born in 1839. He was 21 years old when the Civil War began. Born in our 8th presidency, Martin Van Buren. And it did seem that Huguette Clark was still alive in the Obama administration. How could that be? And what had happened to the family legacy? And he was on all the magazine covers. There were newspaper cartoons about Huguette as the poor little rich girl inheriting money when she was a teenager. I guess the best way we can put it is that she had tickets on the Titanic and she was still living in New York City on 9/11. But the last photograph of her that had been published, we've seen others now, but the last that had been published was taken on her honeymoon in 1928. Huguette was the anti-Kardashian, right? And so after a while I discovered, I didn't want to bother her once I found her, but I discovered where she was. She lived in a hospital room, first in one hospital, then in another, a simple room, very plain, with round-the-clock nursing care. She'd sort of set up an assisted living situation for herself in a hospital. She died at age 104. She was 2 weeks short of her 105th birthday. And at that point, she had lived in the hospital for 7,364 nights. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So who was her father? In a section, a paragraph from the book, in the souvenir photos of tenderfoot gold miners from Colorado in the 1860s with 6-shooters on their hips, W.A. Clark is on your right. There is no reason to think that 24-year-old W.A. Clark stands out from the pack. People who knew him described him as having a lot of nervous energy, that he never walked, he ran, that his hands were in constant motion, that he was a dynamo of alert intelligence. He was also vain. He weighed 120, 125 pounds, shaped like, thin like a pipe cleaner. His children described him as 5'5", maybe 5'6", with his boots on. After he led the Montana Constitutional Convention, he was chosen to preside over the convention, which led to statehood. We have his passport applications. He listed himself at that point at 5'9". After he led the battle to place the state capitol in Helena, and he was the head of the state Masonic Lodge, and then began to seek office as a United States Senator, he was 5'10". He really was a Horatio Alger character. Born in a log cabin in Pennsylvania, he went west to Iowa, taught a little school from a farming family, got some education, got part of an undergraduate education with a year of law, and then went west at the beginning of the Civil War, maybe to escape the draft that would be coming, maybe to seek gold fortune in Colorado, and then wandered from Bannock up into the Butte area. He was really starting out as a merchant. He was selling eggs that he brought over through the snow from Salt Lake. He was ran a little store, first off of a mule and then from a small building. Then he became a banker, an assayer, a person trading money for gold. And he seemed to have a talent for turning $1 into 20. He delivered the mail, nearly died when a horse dragged him down into a river, an icy river. He was clearly a self-made man. Became a banker, a rather prideful one. He went into business with his brother. The bank was not called Clark Brothers. The bank was called W.A. Clark and Brother. there were two different brothers in business with him at the time. Maybe it was just a generic brother, maybe, I don't know. Here's just some family pictures I'll run through. My co-author, Paul Clark Newell Jr.'s father is the little boy in the front on the left. Paul died in 2016. I was very lucky to hook up with him, and he had researched the family history. That's the senator near the left, and Paul's mother is in the center of the picture. She was the senator's younger sister. And they're on the front porch of the mother's house in Los Angeles. The family essentially migrated in the early 1900s to Los Angeles. And we'll just let some other pictures play. I'd like to just read a fat paragraph that tries to sum up the astounding career of W.A. Clark. Well, first a bit of his vanity. When the slightly built man in the black frock coat and silk top hat stepped briskly down New York's Fifth Avenue in the Easter Sunday parade of 1914, the gawkers saw his face and recognized him instantly. His bristly beard and mustache may have turned from auburn to gray, but at 75 years of age, he was the picture of sartorial eminence. The proud little man was accompanied by 3 discreet touches of male vanity: a gold watch chain hanging from his dapper white waistcoat, a polka-dotted silk cravat held tightly to his high collar by a pearl stick pin, and his 36-year-old wife. Skipping on. An indefatigable worker, W.A. Clark carried on at a pace that today seems impossible, especially in an era when travel was by steamship and railroad, and communication by letter and telegram. During the first decade of the 1900s, for example, he maintained homes in Paris and Montana, built and furnished the most expensive house in New York City, constructed out of his own pocket a major railroad between Los Angeles Harbor and Salt Lake City. Along the way, subdivided and marketed lots for the city of Las Vegas, which is in Clark County today. Oversaw the operation of copper mines in several western states, ran streetcar and electric power companies in the West, and as you know, built the Milltown Dam here. Copper wire factory in the East, grew sugar beets in California, published several newspapers, owned a bank with a good national reputation, was forced to resign from the U.S. Senate, then was reelected and served 6 more years. Fought off a paternity suit filed by a young woman he had met at the Democratic National Convention. Some things never change. Maintained good relations with his adult children, married a young wife, and sired 2 daughters, all while in his 60s. Though often chosen as a leader because of his intelligence, resolve, and deep pockets, he was not blessed with a magnetic disposition. W.A. Clark was introverted and extremely private. If people didn't like what he did, they were wrong. And yet he did give a damn about some things, including family, art, and social prominence. He was a seeker of public attention, not a great orator, but a persistent one. He cheerfully took center stage to lead the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner at public events and didn't limit himself to the familiar first stanza. In the pocket of his cutaway coat, W.A. carried 2 grades of cigars, fine ones for himself and lesser ones to give away. W.A. Clark's career in Montana is so sprawling, but I'm just going to run through it very quickly in a way through just showing you some pictures. You're familiar with the Milltown Dam. You're familiar with the environmental problems that came along afterwards and the arsenic that you find in the trout that you catch. His biggest fights were with his mining competitor, Marcus Daly, a fight over where to locate the state capitol, a fight over control of the Senate seats. I find the most amusing the escapade where Clark had been sent to by the legislators, which then chose the U.S. senators, was waiting in Washington just sort of in abeyance, in purgatory, while the Senate debated the fact that he clearly had bought the seat. A committee, an ethics committee, was looking into whether or not to seat him. Your legislators had begun the legislative session with debts, and by the end of the session they had no debts. One gentleman's debts were quite large, and Clark bought the bank to whom the debts were owed and then forgave them. And was able to win the vote. But it became clear that the Senate would not seat him, and so a report was about to come out and he was going to be refused. So they came up with another escapade, which really ought to be an episode in a television show someday. They got the governor of Montana, who was against the Clark interests, out of the state by sending him to assess some property in San Francisco. They put him on the train. Then Clark resigned from the Senate seat, and the lieutenant governor, who was friendly to the Clark interests, then appointed a successor to W.A. Clark. 3 guesses whom he appointed to replace W.A. Clark. Of course, the governor came back eventually from the trip and unwound the whole affair. But it's noticeable how proud they were of themselves with this little escapade. Of course, Clark and the senator on the right's from Pennsylvania, Clark and other examples led to the constitutional amendment, taking from legislature the right to choose the United States senators and giving that vote to the people who were thought to be less corruptible. This was before Facebook. The other way that Clark is best known is through the environmental damage that was left from the mines. Part of it his doing, part of it the doing of his competitor, Daley, and the Anaconda Company, and the Standard Oil men that bought that company. The Berkeley pit, you can see in Butte, where they have to fire the sound of a rifle on the hour to keep the migrating birds from landing and drinking the arsenical water and dying. There were other legacies in Montana, the Columbia Gardens, the amusement park that many people, older people, remember in Butte. His son had a lodge called Mowitza Lodge on Salmon Lake, which is now called Legendary Lodge and is owned by Roman Catholic Archdiocese. But the environmental remains in Butte are, I think, in this state thought of as his undying legacy. I'll quote W.A. Clark on this matter. He seemed relatively unmoved. In his farewell address to the Senate in 1907, W.A. Clark explained his view of the responsibilities of one generation to another in regard to the Earth's resources. He said, "In rearing the great structure of empire on the Western Hemisphere, we are obliged to avail ourselves of all the resources at our command. The requirements of this great utilitarian age demand it. Those who succeed us can well take care of themselves." This is the Copper King Mansion, now a bed and breakfast. It was W.A. Clark's home in Butte. His daughter, Huguette, from the second marriage, visited there in her teens. And there's this photograph of her as a child with dolls on the front porch of that house. And here's some nice photos you may not have seen of the inside of that Copper King Mansion in Butte. It's really something to see. Tall windows in the parlor open so you can step right out onto they lift up from the ground so you can step right out onto the porch to smoke your cigars after dinner. This shower is like going through a car wash. You've got to go stay there just to try that. But the house that this art now in Montana came from was a house on Fifth Avenue in New York City. So let's talk a bit about that. This was Huguette Clark's childhood home, only 121 rooms for a family of 4. It was easily the most expensive home built in New York City. It's hard to make good inflation adjustments, but it's roughly $250 million, the cost, about $250 million in today's dollars to build a home. And it was lived in for 14 or 15 years. It was finished in approximately 1910. The old man died in 1925, and it was torn down. They moved out then, and then it was torn down in 27, and there's an apartment building in its place now. It was with a rail car underneath to bring in coal for the furnaces, Turkish baths in the basement, a quarantine space, not sufficient, but a quarantine space up in the tower. It was more than anybody could afford, and it became an apartment building. And here are just a few pictures of. I like this picture because it has a horse and a horseless carriage, both parked at the door. It was much ridiculed at the time for its gaudiness, but I think a lot of people in New York City wish it were there to visit today. They sold tickets to the public to visit. I think it was 50 cents or a quarter to tour after the Clarks moved out, before the home was torn down. The builder, the destroyer of the house, made some money by charging people. Charlie Chaplin was among those who took a tour. And a few pictures of the inside. This room still exists. It came out of a French home, and after the Clarks left the house, this moved to the Corcoran Gallery where the art went in Washington, D.C., and this golden room, or Salon Doré, is still there. There's no more Corcoran Gallery, but this room is still there. And 2 of the pieces in the collection across the hall are hanging on the right side, or back and right of this photograph. This is a pipe organ. $120,000 was spent at that time in the early 1900s to buy this pipe organ to pipe music into the 5 galleries. Imagine being a shy child like Huguette Clark, an artist, not outgoing at all, growing up in a house where your father handed out tickets to come and tour the 5 art galleries on Saturday from 3 to 6 p.m. And in the style of that time, you have the art hung 3 or 4 or 5 high all around. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir played in the parlor of this home. You know you have a large home if they can sing in your parlor. Clark tried to leave his art collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art just up Fifth Avenue in New York, but with the stipulation that it remain together forever and be on view. And they said, well, they would have to have bought this home to have accomplished that. And after much debate, they turned down the Clark art. So it went to the Corcoran in Washington, which then has gone belly up, and that's how some pieces became available to come to you. These are some of the private upstairs spaces of the home. Now, these were show pictures made to entice people to come tour the home. Showgirls at the piano, and let's see how many we can fit in the fireplace. The wastefulness of it really is something. This stairwell was thrown into the bay in Queens, New York, because there was no place to put it. There was no house for it. This is a photograph of the home being demolished. All right. For me, the story at first was just a mystery. Where's Huguette? And then I sort of lost interest when I found she was in a hospital. I wasn't going to go barging into a 100-year-old woman's hospital room. But then we started to, because of that publication of a slideshow about the Clarks, and I started to hear from people with more information about what was going on. I knew a house was for sale. Some paintings had been sold. The biggest red flag was that one of her nurses had received $30 million in gifts over a period of 20 years, her sort of favorite day nurse. So here's a woman who hasn't been out of the house in 50 years, who's quite reclusive. Is she being manipulated, or things being siphoned off from her? So it switched from a mystery story for me into sort of an investigation. And then after Huguette died, it became a fight over the money, because relatives, she cut out all her relatives from the will, and so family from the father's first marriage, his grandchildren from his first marriage, so her half-great nieces and nephews, challenged the will. And essentially saying, she's not using her homes, she collects dolls, she must be crazy. She must be incompetent, and she must have been manipulated by her attorney and accountant, who are in the will as beneficiaries, and by the nurse, who's in the will for more money. She must be manipulated. All right. I'm going to show you a few family pictures, and I'm just going to let those play. They'll go by quickly. These are photographs of W.A. Clark and his second family. Young wife Anna, who was living in a boarding home in Butte, not a wealthy family at all, and married the richest man west of the Mississippi. He might have been the richest American. When Huguette was 1 year old in 1907, the New York Times tried to figure out who the wealthiest American was. And they said, it's either John Rockefeller with his oil money, or if you count what's still in the mines, you might say it's W.A. Clark with his mines in Arizona and Montana. Just a few facts about Huguette's life, just to sort of fill in some missing pieces. Huguette had an older sister who died of meningitis at 16 when Huguette was 12. This was before penicillin. The father died in 25, and Huguette was 18 at that point. The house was sold. She got an equal share of the fortune with the children from the first marriage, who, you'll note, already got theirs. The father died in 25. The house was torn down in 27. We don't know the size of the fortune, but it would be roughly $1 to $3 billion today. He was not that charitable. We'll talk about his charities in a minute, but it works out to about $600,000 in cash to charities. The most went to the family. Huguette was married. She was married in 1928 to a young Princeton grad who was the family accountant's son. Maybe it was arranged, maybe not. They had a very quiet wedding at the vacation home in Santa Barbara. They had a honeymoon. She got in her 1927 gray Rolls Royce, a gift from her mother, and they went off to San Francisco and then on the boat to Hawaii. They were married for 2 years, officially. Then they went to Reno. She went to Reno with her mother, got a whole floor in the hotel, and stayed the required 3 months to qualify to have her marriage renovated. And she was free. But it didn't seem it really lasted that long. She told her nurse later, on the honeymoon, I had to go home. Raise your hand if you've ever had that feeling. Right? Yeah. So it's very common. So the Great Depression came. Huguette spent her time as an artist. She was well educated at Miss Spence's School for Girls in New York City. Just a couple years later, after her graduation in 25, most of the girls went on to college. But in her era, they got married. That's what she had done. But she was trained as an artist and continued to be an amateur artist the rest of her life. She also was a collector of art, of Japanese history, of dolls, of animation. She had many pursuits. Also, Stradivarius instruments. She had 7 to 9 Stradivarius violins, including the best in the world. She had no children. And she and her mother lived quietly in different apartments in that Fifth Avenue building, and then visited Santa Barbara quite recently, quite regularly, where her mother rebuilt a home there. The Clark daughters got out of the mining business finally in the 1930s. Much of it they'd started to get out, Clark had, in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. But by the 30s, they sold the last bits of mine in Arizona. Huguette went out. She entertained. She flew in an airplane. She went to the opera. Her mother was very fond of music. But somewhere along the line, she became quite reclusive and stay at home, somewhat like her mother, who lost her hearing in middle age. We know she went out of the house in the 1950s to get her best Stradivarius violin restrung. We know she went out in the 60s to the French consulate because there was a show of Christian Dior clothing from Paris, and she wanted to buy the latest fashions, not for herself, but for her dolls. And then it turned out that after an illness, she'd gone into a hospital with an illness with some facial cancer. She went in, got treated, was fine, and then decided to stay in the hospital. She said, "I feel safer here." She did have much more sort of society than you would think. She had a best friend who would visit her almost daily and bring her food. She had the man who took care of her apartments who would bring over whatever Huguette needed. She would call over and she'd say, "Oh, there's a book on Kabuki theater. It's on the 3rd shelf, 6th book from the right. Would you bring that one over?" She would ask for whatever she needed that day in the hospital room, and he would bring it over. Oops. I want to give you just a little bit of a snippet of her voice. I'm just going to play for you a couple of snippets so you can hear Huguette Clark. Paul Clark Newell, Jr., her cousin, who called her Aunt Huguette, but they were cousins, was a much better investigative reporter than I was. He thought to look up Huguette Clark in the Santa Barbara telephone directory. That had not occurred to me. And he spoke to the caretaker of the home there, who gave him contact information for her attorney in New York, and they talked off and on for a decade, maybe 50 phone calls. He never knew, Paul never knew that Huguette was living in a hospital. The calls would be arranged through the attorney. She would call him at the time arranged. She never seemed ill or anything less than chipper and elegant and appropriate. Never occurred to him that she wasn't living in that apartment on Fifth Avenue. This is the first voicemail message. She and Paul had never spoken, but he'd left a message the first time or sent word to her. He never had her phone number. And this is her call to him. It's going to be a little loud, but I want you to be able to hear through her accent. It's closed captioned. You'll see her words on the screen. While we're fixing that, let me just comment about this weird situation of trying to write a book. 2 people trying to drive a book, like driving a car together. And Paul was the most generous co-pilot you could possibly have. He had all the records his father had gathered from Montana, and he'd spoken to all these older relatives, and he was just the most congenial co-pilot to work with. And the most ruffled he would get is if I tried to change something he wrote. He'd say, "You know, Bill, I was the editor of the college newspaper at Occidental College in '51. You think we're up?
Oh, this is your Aunt Huguette, and I did call the other number, but I didn't get an answer. So I'm believing that I'll call you up soon again, because just now I have chicken pox of all the things to get a hold of at my age, imagine. So anyway, but I'm getting along fine. The fever went down and everything's okay. And much love and thank you for the pictures. Your daughter's beautiful, and your little grandson is adorable. Your little grandson, Eric.
The voicemail message cuts off at that point. But just notice how elegant and appropriate she is. She's in her early 90s at this point. She's prepared for this conversation with this cousin she's never met. He's written to her. She's ready, has ready the name of his grandson, and she's ready to thank him for the pictures he sent. She's, for a woman who's famously reclusive, she's telling him about an illness that she has. Doesn't sound incompetent or strange in any way. And that was Paul's experience throughout. I just want to mention here a little bit about her her memory. This is Huguette describing events in 1912. The only words on the screen are her words. You'll hear Paul, but the only part transcribed is Huguette.
It seemed to me you told me some time ago about your return trip, how you'd been booked to go on the Titanic back to Europe.
We didn't get on the Titanic. We were booked to go.
Yes.
But then actually never got to New York because it sank before we got in.
Yes. Which boat did you take then?
So we took another boat after.
Yes.
I think it was for George Washington.
We had to take another boat. But it was a serious event in the family. She had a first cousin who died on the Titanic. It was in that family picture on the steps earlier. Here she's recalling the Santa Barbara earthquake. She had, I was mentioning she had more society than you'd think. Huguette, in those 20 years in a hospital room, she had CNN, she had the New York Times, she had visitors. Every call with Paul begins with, "Oh, I hear there are wildfires. Are they near you in Santa Barbara or San Diego?" She was very up on today's news. She followed the Clinton-Lewinsky matter. You know, she was up on the news. Here they were talking about earthquakes in Turkey, which had been in the news. A deadly earthquake there had been in the news that week. And she describes what had happened with their home in Santa Barbara in 1925.
Always national catastrophes, international catastrophes.
Santa Barbara during the 1925 earthquake, 1925. The movie theater that we used to go to, that came all down, imagine. Many people would have been killed if it had been, you know, it was at 6 in the morning.
Yes.
So many people were saved. That's why Mother built another house, because it wasn't very solid, you know. Anyway, there was something, you know, that shaking.
Oh, it's terrifying.
Yes, terrible, yes.
Yes.
But it was nothing in comparison to Turkey.
And I have just one more. This is Paul's telling her that his daughter's gone to Hawaii, and you'll notice that her memory is better than his.
From my granddaughter?
Granddaughter.
Yes.
Does she still dance the ballet?
Oh, she's working away at it. They've had a lovely time. They went to Hawaii for a vacation several weeks ago and got out of the cold weather.
Honolulu.
Yes, they did go to Waikiki, that's right. Have you been there?
Oh, yes, I was there when I was 15 and then when I was 22 and 23. I went there several times.
You traveled with your family there?
My father in 1915. We went to Honolulu at Waikiki Beach. It was lovely there. I think it was more pleasant in those days because it wasn't so built up.
It's very commercial now.
Very commercial, yes.
Yes. Was the Royal Hawaiian Hotel built at that time?
That's where we were.
Oh, how nice.
Hotel.
In 1915.
Is it still?
It's still there, yes.
Oh, I see.
Yes, it is. And the other one I think is called the Awani or something like that is also still there.
First of all, in 1915 we went to the Moana Hotel.
Moana, that's what I was thinking of.
It's still there too?
Yes, it is.
My expectations of Huguette as this reclusive woman, maybe not even still sentient at 103, 104, being taken advantage of by people. We ended up reading 20,000 pages of her medical records and 20,000 pages of her correspondence and financial records, and it's clear that she was, like her father, stubborn, did what she wanted to do, refused all attempts to sign a will for 50 years. She'd say, well, we'll do it after the holidays. And there were always more holidays. My impression of her was affected most by these tape recordings, but also by her paintings, which I'll show you some of the artwork that she did. I'll let those play. This is this is a painting of Huguette keeping her eyes firmly on the canvas. A painting made by her instructor, Tadej Stika. You can see his work in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. And he painted FDR's mother. But he was the society painter of the day. In New York City, he would paint you or your dog or both, and he was Huguette's. These are some sort of off-kilter images of paintings by him that hang in the home in Santa Barbara, another one by Stika. But then the rest of these are paintings by Huguette. I was affected by those, and also by her generosity. You know, it's funny because I find that maybe we miscalculated some in the writing of the book. I think a lot of people came away with the impression that Huguette was a selfish person. You know, she was spending for houses she wasn't using. The monthly costs of the home in Santa Barbara were only $40,000 per month in the 1990s. Huguette's monthly nut in the 1990s, looking at her records, was about $400,000. Her monthly costs were about $400,000 for the attorneys and the 3 homes and all the rest. And you know, when you spend for $30,000 for a doll in the same month that the Paul Clark Home for Orphans in Butte is asking for money for a new roof and you don't send it, then you come off as not generous. But we included stories that just really struck me about Huguette's generosity. My favorite was the woman who was taking care, was a home health nurse, taking care of someone who Huguette just hardly knew, like an accountant's friend. I mean, just a very tangential person, but she'd been told, this woman takes the bus in every morning, she works really hard, comes in and helps this man who's dying. After he died, Huguette sent her attorney to the woman's door. The attorney says, hello, you don't know me, but I have a client. I'm an attorney, I have a client. You don't know her either, but she's written you a letter, and if you promise never to tell anybody about it, I'll give you the letter. And she says, okay. Of course, she told her daughter about it that night, and then later told me. But that night she was telling her daughter, imagine the kindness of this woman. I don't even know her at all, and she's written me this lovely note on this floral paper with this artistic handwriting, thanking me for taking care of the man. And I couldn't even believe it. She included a check for $300. I don't even know her. And her daughter said, Mama, you'd better sit down. It was a check for $30,000. And you can dismiss charity as, oh, that was a small amount of what Huguette had. It was a small matter to her, but she was always surprising friends and strangers with you know, amazing gifts. You could say, oh, her nurse must have influenced her to get all those gifts, but Huguette was the one who kept pushing them. She'd give Hadassah a check in the morning and another one in the afternoon. She gave her her 3rd best violin, not second fiddle, but 3rd. And Hadassah, the nurse, said, well, Madame, my son played the violin when he was this high, but he's in college now. He doesn't play anymore. Oh, he'll take it up again. He'll take it up again. So the husband drove over, and they put the Strad in the back seat and drove it back home to Brooklyn. If you are aware of another registered nurse with 7 houses, please see me after the program. I'd like to hear about it. So I came to like Huguette through her generosity. I thought that was her best quality. She was also sentimental, and she held on to things like the unused houses, partly because she was sentimental and she didn't need to sell them. A lot of people sort of jump to the conclusion of incompetence also because she collected dolls. Now let's vote. How many people think dolls are elegant, Americana, elegant, charming? Well, we got 4 people. And how many people think dolls are creepy? All right. They're not as bad as clowns. So there, we've seen Huguette's paintings, but I'm going to show you the dolls unless you tell me I can't. Do you want to see the dolls? Okay. We have nice pictures of a few dolls. The doll collection was given to a new foundation for the arts that we'll talk about in just a moment in Santa Barbara, and they don't need 5,000 dolls. So they're going to make one little room upstairs. You can go in there if you want or avoid it, and they'll have the best of the dolls in that little room, and they'll sell the rest to raise money for the Arts Foundation. There's a French tune being played on Huguette's best Stradivarius, along with these good pictures of a couple of her dolls, and then some just little snapshots that her man made for her, little snapshots of some others in her collection, just so you can see what she had. You've been warned, okay. Huguette also collected toy soldiers and castles and even Barbies. I watched a deposition testimony by her man who took care of her apartments, taking great pains to explain to the attorneys, you're jumping to a conclusion that there must be something wrong with her because she collected Barbies. These were $60,000 Barbies. And if he just kept saying, if you had met her, you wouldn't think that. That's the home in Butte. Now I want to quickly show you, before we run out of time, a little bit about Clark charities, including Huguette's, but starting first with the fathers. Where did the Clark money go? You're getting a little satisfaction that a few pennies of it are coming back to Montana. Where did the money go? If you look at where the W.A. Clark and his daughter and his sons from the first marriage, where they gave their money, this is where it went. Founded the Los Angeles Philharmonic, which is in its 100th year. We have tape recordings of W.A. Clark Jr. recording on ship, like a dictaphone on a record, sending to the concertmaster of the Los Angeles Philharmonic saying, "Don't allow any jazz. We're not having any jazz." The Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. The Clark Library at UCLA is really something to see. The shelves are made of copper. The father founded a home for working women to have a safe place to live in Los Angeles, named for his mother. The home for orphans in Butte, named for a son who died young. The Arts Chateau, that's one of the sons' homes in Butte where they're having arts programming now. an Episcopal church and stained glass windows in Butte. Halls at the University of Virginia, and at UNLV. That one's not shown here. The first National Girl Scouts camp named for the sister who died young. A ranch for the Boy Scouts outside Santa Barbara. A bird refuge cleaned up and needing more cleanup in Santa Barbara. And the biggest is that Huguette's will left, she tried to give, if it hadn't been for the challenge to her will, she tried to leave 2/3 of her money to a new foundation for the arts. They ended up getting this home worth about $85 to $100 million, and they got about $10 million in cash, and they said they're going to make an art museum and a place you can go see concerts up at her home on the bluff and overlooking the Pacific. And they can probably pay some of the bills by renting it out for weddings, too. But here are just a few pictures made in the past year of that home. Built in the 1930s. And the pictures today still look like the photographs made in the 1940s inside that home. I'm just going to play a little of the photos of that home, a little video. And we're going to take some questions. Huguette really is, on that last point, an example of what not to do in estate planning. Just to tally it up, the relatives got $40 million. $25 million went to legal fees. $80 million was owed on gift taxes. And $26 million was paid in estate taxes out of a $300 million estate. So that she is the case of what not to do in estate planning. While we're just looking at some pictures of that home, I want to make sure that we have a few minutes to take some of your questions. Some of you know Clark history. You've been to Butte. You have other interests in that area, whether you want to talk about W.A. Clark or about the daughter, any part of it, I'll be glad to take questions. Yes, ma'am. So what happened to Anna? Well, Anna died in 1963. She was quite ill in her last years. One amusing fact, I think, is that Anna Clark, that's the second wife, Huguette's mother, lived on the 8th floor of a building, and Marcus Daly's widow lived on the 1st or 2nd floor of the same building. It was the building to move into. It was the nicest building in Fifth Avenue. They were neighbors. Probably got along well. Clark had fought with Harriman on the railroads from the Union Pacific Railroad, but Anna Clark and Mrs. Harriman ended up sharing a box together for several years at the Metropolitan Opera. Anna Clark's interests were all in music. She played the harp. She took lessons from Grandgeny, the best-known harpist, and he dedicated many. She was his patron. He dedicated many pieces to her and also to Huguette. He would write a piece for Sleeping Beauty or some such fairy tale and dedicate it to Huguette on the composition. And she had several years of illness in the end and died in 63, which means Huguette was 57. So Huguette lived almost another 50 years after her mother died. And the mother was quite reclusive. I think the reclusivity seems to come sort of from the mother's habit of being very stay-at-home. She would bring in music. Her big charity was a quartet. She founded a touring group called the Paganini Quartet because she gave them 4 Stradivarius instruments that had been owned by Paganini. She bought them a house on the Coast Road in Carmel so they'd have a place to practice. They would play in the garden at Bellasguardo in Santa Barbara for Anna and their guests. And the house is full of all their records, Debussy or whoever they were recording that year. And but Anna was all about the music and art. And had a couple of godchildren she doted after. But she died, with no other relatives other than her a sister and her surviving daughter, Huguette. Yes?
In your book, do you
We talk a little bit about the marriage. Well, I talked to I was most surprised, going through her papers to find 30, it's a brief marriage, 2 years, and she says I had to go home on the honeymoon. And then I'm finding telegrams from 30 years later where she's writing to her ex-husband in France saying, oh, come visit me when you're in New York, and oh, I'm so sorry to hear that your dog died, and where will you be staying when you come in? And they were very friendly. And then I later spoke with a man who lived with the ex-husband in France years later, and he said that Huguette would call. She'd say, oh, I sent that Falcon Crest episode on VHS. Did you get the videotape? Did you get that? And do you have a good TV for watching the moon landing? I'll get you another TV if you don't. And she was just like the attentive friend from the States trying to make sure that they got whatever she was interested in, and she would send over to them. And you get the impression that Huguette didn't want to be married. She certainly had suitors after that brief marriage. She could have married again. He married again. It seems as though she didn't have any interest in she lived alone. She had staff, and then eventually she outlived her staff and was living in 40-plus rooms all by herself before she went to the hospital. It was not really a safe situation. But it seemed as though she probably wasn't prepared for marriage, and it didn't last long. She continued to refer to herself as Mrs. Clark the rest of her life, which was against the sort of custom of the day, but didn't seem to be interested. There would be every 20 years in the New York papers a gossip column about what's going on with Huguette Clark. Charlie Knickerbocker would write about Huguette Clark every decade or so. But there were suitors, and she had a boyfriend. In effect, it seemed like a boyfriend, a fiance. At one point, there was a report in the columns they were to be married from France, a childhood friend. But it seemed as though I don't know how serious her interest was, but he was eager to get hooked up with her and her money, right? And he was sort of a pretend marquis from a family that was not noble, and but they wrote dear letters back and forth to each other. But then eventually he married someone else and had children, and she, Huguette, hey, they're children. So Huguette was sending gifts to the children. His daughter had to put she told me, I put another room on the house to hold all the gifts that Huguette sent for the children. Her correspondence is full of, she would send gifts to, if you're her doctor, you're the man who takes care of her dollhouses, anything. She's sending you a pension, she's sending a check to you after you die, to your widow, to your grandchildren. She's sending them gifts. And then they're sending photographs back. So her correspondence is full of children in suits of armor, girls with the world's largest dollhouses, Yes?
These days, we've got such a sensitivity to the notion of people coming into Montana and using the resources and then making off with all of the wealth.
The question is about the pathology of Montanans, I believe. Is that correct?
No, the question is, given that perspective we now have, is there any evidence that a perspective of that variety ever showed itself within the family? Did they have a sensitivity to that? Did it matter? At any time during the generations that you...
The question is about whether the family had sensitivity to this question of being outsiders. Huguette, for example, turned down the Paul Clark home, which the Clark money had gone to when they were asking for gifts. And I think it makes sense that that would have been just not wanting to have every charity in the state have its hand out. She valued her privacy. She liked to give money to people, she said, to whom she knew. She liked to give money where she knew she could see the person. I don't sense that. I mean, they had interests in Arizona where the mines were, and in Los Angeles, and here were the largest interests. And in a way, they were transplants, but so was when they moved to Los Angeles, there were 10,000 people there. Everybody was from somewhere. So I'm not sure they had that feeling. I'm defensive on her behalf to the idea that people think that she was selfish, because I think part of that is that we tend not to think of arts as charity. We tend to think of human services, and we tend not to think of art as a human service, which of course it is. But that was where their passion lay, was in giving her greatest asset and her art for a new museum, a place for the arts, partly as a legacy for her mother and partly because that's what she cared about. Clearly she just didn't need to see these things. She came to Butte, by the way, several times, and she came to Salmon Lake. There didn't seem to be any estrangement with the first family at that period, at least some members of the first family, because she and her sister would come visit her half-brother on Salmon Lake at the lodge. Other questions? Yes.
We know that Clark left a huge estate, and I'm just wondering whatever became of it. Marcus Daly's fortune kind of dissipated. But is there still a lot of money left in the Clark family?
Is there a lot of money still left in the Clark family? Well, I had relatives, who were fighting her will, and if they could invalidate the will, there was no other relative, so it would go sort of back up to the father and down to them, and all the money would come to them. And they were saying, we're not really that as wealthy as you think. So they kept making that point to me. But I noted that their addresses were in Carmel and East 72nd Street in New York, and nice places. One of her half-brothers, the older brother, Charlie Clark, the one with the art chateau in Butte, squandered an awful lot of money on racehorses and divorces. But he married into a wealthy family, the Tobin family, banking family from San Francisco. W.A. Clark Jr. gave to his passions. He collected books, had a library, an observatory, later created and bought some newspapers in Montana to continue the fight with the dailies. And the family's about $40 million richer than it was 10 years ago through the settlement of their claim against Huguette's estate. Somebody else over here? Yes.
What piqued her interest in the Japanese type art?
Why was she interested in the Japanese art? Well, it's interesting. I think it was partly a feature of the times, the late 1880s to 1920 period. There was a lot of flowering of interest in Oriental art in the United States and around the world. And
did she visit Japan?
No. So Paul, her cousin, asked her what you would think would be a quite natural question. She had sent him her favorite book, a pearlesque book about Japan. She had described to him at great length her Hina dolls and tried to get him to understand what a Hina doll collection was. She painted these Japanese portraits 9 feet tall. She collected an enormous amount of hair pieces and kimono. She commissioned, there's on display in Santa Barbara a kimono with 12 layers of silk, like a replica of a 12th century royal wedding gown. So Paul says, "Oh, Aunt Huguette, when did you last go to Japan?" And she says, "Oh, no, I've never been." Part of what interested me in her story in the end, as we were putting the book together, was this question of, well, what would I do if I were in her circumstance? If you had the advantages and some disadvantages of being born in, you're going to high school with the Carnegie daughter and you're wealthier than she is. You're very shy and your father's on the magazine covers and disreputable from his politics that ruined his reputation. If you were facing all that situation, how would you spend your life and your money? You'd have a better view than she chose to have at the end at the hospital room. And you'd go to Japan. She traveled in Europe as a youth. She had traveled. But she said, "Oh, no, I've never been," just quite pleasantly, as though it didn't bother her at all. Yes?
Did you say the Santa Barbara home, you could tour it?
Yeah, the Santa Barbara home is in transition now. The foundation called the Bella Sguardo Foundation has received the home. The question is, can you tour it? Right now, you can go to the cemetery next door and look over the fence, the wall. But their plan is to make it a museum. They had a big fundraising party there in October with 500 people having dinner on the lawn. They had a wedding party there the other day, and they're trying to raise money. I gave a tour there as a fundraiser for the foundation, and their goal is to open it. But they have a lot of work to do. They have all the rooms opened and set up now, and I would guess it's 2 years. Dick Wolf of Law and Order producing fame is the chair of the board, and he has said, well, we're going to make an art museum. We're going to bring in great art. And I think he means not to have a collection, but to have traveling exhibits. This last slide showed, are we out of time? You're hovering. You want to know where the money went. So this is just a little collection of some of the items that Huguette owned at her death that were auctioned off. You'll see dresses here, and furniture, and books, and paintings. And this is just a little tour of what she owned at her death. These are Fortuny dresses from Paris. Over here, yes. The Arizona copper operation was said to be, at its height, around World War I, was said to be the richest copper mine in the world. W.A. Clark had been at a state fair and had seen some samples from that mine, and he went down there and bought it. And as was his genius, as he did in Butte, where he built the smelter, as he did there, he extended the railroad to get to it. In other words, he was very apt at figuring out what capital needed to be expended to extract the wealth that was trapped in those hills. And if you visit Jerome, Arizona today, it's a magnificent arts community, revived ghost town. It's worth seeing. And the company town, Clarkdale, is next door and has a couple of little things to see. But that mine was said to be the largest in the world. Now, maybe there were some in Peru that were, but it was in the top few. Over a great length of time, it seems that more money was taken out of Butte in gold and silver and copper and zinc, etc. But I'm not sure we can say how it ranks. Yes, back there?
Is Paul Newell still alive?
No, Paul died in 2016 in his 80s. Which papers?
You say he had a lot of
Yeah. So Paul and I agreed early on that we would give everything when we were done, and we will, to the Clark Library at UCLA, which had been very kind to let him work there and look into Clark history. Huguette's papers are all also going in the settlement of the lawsuit. Everything on paper that she owned is going to the Clark Library at UCLA as well. It's not there yet, but Professor Edgerton and I are going to go down there and have a good old time going through the boxes someday. Our hope is that there's W.A. Clark correspondence with his wives and children and others. But so that's where everything, I think, except the family Bible, which his daughter has, but she's dealing with his estate, and all the other things, she's in touch with the Clark Library, and copies of obituaries and speeches, and his diary, W.A. Clark's diary about the horse dragging him into the river and the frozen river, etc. All of that's going to the Clark Library at UCLA. In there? Yes. Yes.
were there reclamation problems in Arizona?
I don't know if there were reclamation problems in Arizona. I didn't hear much there. The Arizonans did not seem to have the same resentment that the Montanans had. Same problems. And it's a shared responsibility. You know, Gailey, like the Berkeley pit in Butte is really the fault of the Anaconda company that bought the Daly interests and was a Standard Oil company. But it's a shared responsibility, clearly. You know, Clark had the smelter that was belting out all that arsenic. But I didn't hear much about the environmental issues. That's a good question. I did not hear much about that in Arizona. Yes. I'm just going to keep going until you make me stop.
One more
Yes.
question.
There we go.
A few years ago, there was a lecturer on campus that was a Clark relative and a French diplomat. Is your co-author that guy?
Yeah, I know who you mean. Before Paul was calling his cousin Huguette to quiz her about family history, and he was very delicate about it because she didn't want to be quizzed. She wouldn't have responded to a questionnaire, right? So, but Paul would go take pictures of the home that her father was born in, or the home he built with his father when he was 12, and he would send things to her, and then she would send him cards and letters and photographs, and it took her a while to be comfortable with him. But before Paul, there was another cousin, Andre Bayen's, who came here and gave a talk at the university. He wrote a book in French about the senator who loved France. That's the name of it, The Senator Who Loved France. It was about Senator Clark and his close affiliation in his sort of Francophile family, and how he'd taken his second family over there, Anna, to study the harp in Paris. Huguette and her sister were born in France. And so he came here because of the Clark-Montana connection. When that book came out, it's available. You can find it online, but it's in French only. And Andre was very kind to work with Paul to share information. There's a lovely photograph on our website of Paul and his cousin Andre standing in front of a portrait of the senator, and they bear quite a... Paul could have played the senator in the film. The book was optioned. Ryan Murphy optioned it. Then he didn't make a film. So now we're talking to another company which is talking about a TV series, like a episodic, some sort of 6-part or seasonal TV series about the Clark family. And, you know, it's a crapshoot whether anything will ever get made, but we're in discussions about that. He's not going to let you ask this question. Please, after here, please go across. If you have a book you brought with you or you buy one, I'll sign it. Please do not leave without going in and seeing the art across the hall.
And please do not leave without thanking this man for his great generosity.